$381 million. That's how much was built on my grandfather's land while an HOA president secretly pocketed rent for 15 years. She insulted me on my own property, never knowing her mansion legally belonged to me. If you love real HOA justice, karma, and powerful takedowns, hit subscribe now, because the real reckoning is just beginning. 3 days after my grandfather Ezra died, I drove 12 straight hours from Ohio into the Colorado mountains with my credit card maxed out and my life hanging by a thread. I was behind on rent, working as a mechanic, hands permanently stained with grease, expecting nothing more than an old cabin and enough debt to bury me. My entire childhood had been built around the idea that my grandfather had ruined our family by buying worthless mountain land instead of something sensible. That story had been repeated so many times it felt like truth. The cabin sat exactly where I remembered it, tucked into pine trees that whispered in the wind like they had secrets. The air smelled clean, sharp, and unforgiving. Inside, everything was frozen in time. His coffee mug still rested on the table. His reading glasses lay folded beside stacks of yellowed maps and handwritten notes. Dust floated in the sunlight, and for the first time since I got the call, the loss finally hit me. I spent hours sorting through his papers, expecting nothing more than tax bills and forgotten memories. What I found instead were survey maps from the 1940s, engineering notes written in precise handwriting, and contracts dated long before anyone thought this land was valuable. Ezra Brennan hadn't been careless. He had been methodical. That realization was interrupted by the crunch of gravel outside. I stepped onto the porch just as the clicking of designer heels climbed the steps like a metronome of entitlement. The woman standing there looked completely out of place against the backdrop of pine trees and mountain rock. Perfect hair, oversized sunglasses, an accent that sounded rehearsed. Behind her, an expensive Range Rover idled like it owned the place. She introduced herself as the president of the Pinnacle Ridge Homeowners Association and immediately began lecturing me about standards, appearances, and property values. She pointed at my rusted truck like it was a crime scene. She mentioned her husband worked for the county assessor's office. She smiled when she said it, as if it were a threat disguised as small talk. She had no idea who she was talking to. She had no idea where she was standing. I listened quietly while she handed me a violation notice and explained daily fines. She ended the encounter with a comment about my grandfather never fitting in. When she left, the Range Rover disappeared down the road that cut straight through land my family had owned since 1952. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, sheriff's deputies showed up at dawn. A restraining order. A claim that I had threatened her. A dispute over ownership. The pieces started connecting too quickly to ignore. Her husband's position. The confidence. The timing. After they left, I drove into town and went straight to the public library. The librarian knew my grandfather by name. She didn't hesitate when I asked about records. Together, we pulled decades of documents that told a very different story than the one I grew up hearing. The land had never been sold. The assessments had been manipulated. The lease payments had vanished. 15 years of stolen money. 15 years of silence. By noon, I was on the phone with a property attorney who told me to file a quiet title action immediately. She warned me that this kind of fraud didn't happen alone. It required cooperation, influence, protection. While I was building my case, the HOA president was building a narrative. Online groups appeared overnight. Ring camera footage of me checking my mailbox was labeled suspicious. Wellness checks were suddenly scheduled twice a day. The pressure wasn't subtle anymore. Then I caught them dumping construction debris on my land. I watched it happen through the trees, my camera recording every second. Concrete, rebar, roofing material. It wasn't carelessness. It was contamination, an excuse waiting to be written. That evening, a local business owner came to warn me. He explained how donations were demanded in exchange for peace. How inspections appeared when people refused. How power was being rented out like a service. That was when the final piece fell into place. The main road. The only access road. It crossed my land. I laid my grandfather's maps across the table and traced the boundaries with my finger. Every house. Every driveway. Every manicured lawn depended on property my family still owned. My phone rang with another escalation. A federal complaint. A wetlands claim. An attempt to bring in agencies big enough to crush me without asking questions. That night, I found the hidden safe. Behind a false panel, wrapped in leather, were the real contracts. The original lease. The payment records. And a clause my grandfather had underlined twice. Reversion. If payments stopped, everything returned to the landowner. Payments had stopped 15 years ago. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I knew the truth. I didn't just inherit land. I inherited leverage powerful enough to destroy an empire. And the woman who called me trash on my own mountain had built her entire life on a lie that was about to collapse. That was only the beginning. I filed the quiet title action the next morning and didn't tell anyone until the courthouse clerk stamped it official. The sound of that stamp echoed louder than any threat the HOA president had made so far. Once the paperwork was in motion, there was no walking it back. Every claim, every transfer, every lie would now be dragged into the light whether they liked it or not. The reaction was immediate. By lunchtime, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Unknown numbers. Blocked numbers. Messages that swung wildly between fake politeness and thinly veiled threats. I ignored all of them and drove back to the cabin, where the trees stood unmoved by human panic. The land didn't care about titles or lawsuits. It had simply been waiting. That afternoon, I started installing trail cameras along the boundaries. Nothing fancy, just enough to document what happened when people thought no one was watching. Years of turning wrenches had taught me one thing clearly. If someone knows they're wrong, they always escalate when cornered. The escalation came faster than expected. 2 days later, an emergency HOA notice appeared on every door in the subdivision. Mandatory meeting. Immediate threat. Community safety. The language was dramatic, filled with words designed to scare homeowners into compliance. I wasn't invited, but that didn't matter. I didn't need to be in the room to know what was happening. They needed control back. While they rallied fear, I kept digging. County records showed a pattern so clean it was almost insulting. The same signatures. The same adjustments. The same names appearing wherever money changed direction. Property values artificially lowered. Taxes manipulated. Lease payments rerouted through shell management companies. This wasn't incompetence. It was a system. That night, I met with my attorney and laid out everything. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, flipping pages, making notes, occasionally nodding in a way that told me things were worse than I thought. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "You're sitting on one of the strongest reversion cases I've seen," she said. "But you need to understand what happens next." What happened next, she explained, would be ugly. People panic when homes are involved. They lie. They manipulate. They threaten. And the person at the center of it all would not go quietly. She was right. The next morning, sheriff's deputies returned, this time with inspectors. Environmental. Structural. Septic. Clipboards everywhere. Polite smiles stretched thin with obligation. They walked my property, tested water, measured posts, took photos, and found nothing wrong. Everything passed. That should have ended it. Instead, it confirmed something important. The complaints were fabricated. The process was being abused. And every visit created another record pointing back to the same source. That afternoon, a neighbor approached me for the first time. An older woman who had lived there since before the subdivision exploded into luxury housing. She didn't whisper. She didn't hesitate. She told me about families forced out, about fines that never made sense, about payments no one could explain. "You're not the first target," she said. "You're just the one who finally has proof." That night, my attorney called with urgency in her voice. She had reviewed the lease in detail and found what my grandfather had understood decades earlier. The reversion clause wasn't symbolic. It wasn't vague. It was absolute. If lease payments were interrupted for more than 60 consecutive days, all improvements reverted to the landowner. Not the HOA. Not the residents. The landowner. No legitimate payments had been made in 15 years. That meant every structure on the land was legally mine. The number hit me hard when she said it out loud. Hundreds of homes. Hundreds of families. An entire mountainside built on stolen ground. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I just sat there staring at the wall, understanding the weight of what I held. Power like that demanded restraint, or it would turn me into the very thing I was fighting. The HOA president didn't share that restraint. 2 nights later, someone tried to sabotage my cabin. My cameras caught everything. A truck, tools, voices in the dark, instructions whispered with confidence. They didn't know they were being recorded. They didn't know their plan failed the moment they stepped onto my land. When deputies arrived, the crew was gone, but the evidence wasn't. That changed everything. The following day, my attorney contacted federal authorities. Fraud had crossed state lines. Forged documents had been mailed. Money had moved through channels that didn't belong to anyone local anymore. The net widened. Meanwhile, the HOA president tried a different tactic. She showed up in person with a lawyer and a document she claimed proved ownership. It looked convincing at first glance. Aged paper, official stamps, neat signatures. It took less than 30 seconds to see the flaws. Dates didn't line up. Terminology didn't exist at the time. The ink was modern. The signature style didn't match. It was a forgery. A bad one. That document alone shifted the case from civil to criminal. When my attorney forwarded it to federal investigators, their interest turned sharp. Patterns emerged. Similar scams. Different counties. Different names. The woman running the HOA wasn't just corrupt. She was practiced. That night, I opened the safe again and read my grandfather's notes slowly. Every entry told the same story. Intimidation. Legal threats. Financial pressure. Silence bought through fear. He had kept everything. Not because he knew how to fight it, but because he hoped someone after him would. I finally understood why he never acted. He didn't lack proof. He lacked time and strength. And now, both belonged to me. By the end of the week, news vans appeared at the entrance road. Homeowners started asking questions. Board members stopped returning calls. And the woman who once treated me like trash avoided being seen in public. The trap was closing. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was finishing a story that started in 1952, written by a man who believed land was more than property. It was responsibility. And soon, everyone who had built their comfort on stolen ground would have to face that truth. By the time the subpoenas started landing, the tone of the neighborhood changed completely. Fear replaced arrogance almost overnight. The same people who once ignored violation letters were suddenly reading every line of certified mail with shaking hands. The HOA board stopped posting announcements. Their website went dark. Meetings were quietly canceled with vague excuses about ongoing legal review. That silence told me more than any threat ever could. Federal investigators arrived without sirens or drama. Just unmarked vehicles and calm professionals who already knew more than they were letting on. They walked my land carefully, asked precise questions, and requested copies of documents I'd already prepared. They weren't guessing. They were confirming. One agent explained it plainly. Once forged documents cross state lines and money moves through interstate channels, the case stops being local. That's when real consequences begin. Prison-level consequences. The HOA president tried to regain control by going public. She gave an interview claiming I was exploiting a legal technicality to terrorize families. She painted herself as a protector of community values and me as an opportunist. The problem was timing. The reporter already had the evidence. When the article dropped, it wasn't sympathetic. It was surgical. 15 years of manipulated records, shell companies, fraudulent assessments, lease payments rerouted. The piece didn't accuse. It documented. And documentation is what destroys liars. That night, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't anonymous. It was homeowners. Not angry. Terrified. Families wanted to know if they were going to lose their homes. Parents asked what would happen to their kids. Elderly couples asked if they had anywhere else to go. I answered every call the same way. I wasn't here to punish innocent people. I held the legal upper hand, but I also held the moral responsibility. My grandfather's notes echoed in my head. Land wasn't meant to be used as a weapon against the powerless. It was meant to anchor families, not uproot them. So I made an offer. Every homeowner could purchase their lot directly from me at fair market land value, spread over time, with no HOA, no arbitrary fines, and no hidden fees. Those who wanted out would receive relocation assistance funded by recovered assets. The response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the majority of residents signed letters of intent. People who had lived under fear for years finally felt relief. They didn't defend the HOA anymore. They distanced themselves from it. And that's when the HOA president panicked. She tried to flee. Federal agents intercepted her at the airport with cash, documents, and a phone full of incriminating messages. The arrest wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of it traveled faster than any siren ever could. The board collapsed the same day. Resignations poured in. Former allies denied knowing anything. The illusion of authority evaporated instantly. Power, I learned, is incredibly fragile when it's built on lies. The legal proceedings moved fast after that. Accounts were frozen. Properties seized. Assets traced. The scope of the theft shocked even seasoned investigators. What started as stolen lease payments turned into a web of fraud touching banks, contractors, and county officials. And every trail led back to the same source. The woman who once told me to get my truck off her mountain now sat in a holding cell, silent, stripped of influence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The community gathered without HOA permission for the first time in years. No board. No agenda. Just people talking openly. Stories came out. Threats. Harassment. Families forced to sell under pressure. Businesses targeted for refusing to pay donations. It wasn't just theft. It was abuse. My attorney finalized the settlement framework and submitted it to the court. The judge approved it without delay. The reversion clause stood. Ownership was clear. The law didn't hesitate. But enforcement didn't look like bulldozers or evictions. It looked like contracts. Families signed agreements that gave them stability and dignity. Titles transferred cleanly. Payments structured fairly. The land returned to what it was always meant to be, a place to live, not a lever for control. The media shifted its tone again. This time, the narrative wasn't about conflict. It was about accountability. About how ordinary people could fight back when armed with truth and patience. The county launched its own investigation. Officials who enabled the fraud quietly retired or resigned. Policies were reviewed. Oversight tightened. The damage couldn't be undone completely, but it could be stopped. One evening, I walked the boundary road as the sun dropped behind the trees. Houses glowed with warm light. Kids rode bikes without being yelled at. Neighbors talked in driveways without fear of being reported. The land felt different, not because ownership changed but because honesty returned. I thought about my grandfather then, about how he'd watched this happen and believed he'd failed, about how he never saw the ending. But endings don't belong to one person. They belong to time. The HOA president would face sentencing. The stolen money would be redistributed. The community would rebuild without tyranny disguised as order. And I would finally finish what my grandfather started. Not with revenge, but with resolve. Because justice isn't loud. It's thorough. And once it arrives, it doesn't leave room for lies to survive. The sentencing came 6 months later on a gray morning that felt heavier than it looked. I sat in the back of the courtroom, not because I had to, but because I needed to see the end with my own eyes. The woman who once ruled an entire mountainside through fear now stood motionless, her confidence stripped down to a thin, brittle shell. No designer blazer. No rehearsed authority. Just the quiet realization that power borrowed through lies always comes due. The judge didn't rush. He spoke slowly, deliberately, laying out every count in a tone that carried weight. Fraud. Forgery. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. Abuse of authority. Each word landed like a stone. When the sentence was read, there was no gasp, no drama, just a long silence filled with the sound of consequences settling into place. She never looked at me. I didn't need her to. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but I declined every question. The story had already been told. It didn't need my voice added for effect. Justice doesn't require a victory speech. Back home, the changes were already visible. Construction trucks were gone. Security patrols had disappeared. The signs warning residents about violations were being taken down one by one, replaced by nothing at all. For the first time in years, the neighborhood looked like a place people actually lived, not a controlled zone. The new community council met openly in the recreation hall, not behind closed doors. No titles. No intimidation. Just neighbors deciding how they wanted to live. Budgets were transparent. Votes were counted properly. Rules existed, but they were reasonable and enforced evenly. Fear had been replaced by trust. Property titles transferred smoothly over the following weeks. Families who had spent years trapped in legal confusion finally held documents that proved stability. Some cried when they signed. Others laughed. A few simply sat quietly, hands shaking, absorbing the reality that their homes were finally theirs in every sense that mattered. I visited the old cabin often during that time. The same one my grandfather had built, repaired, and defended until his strength failed. I kept his journal on the table, open to the final page. The handwriting was unsteady there, but the words were clear. He had known the truth would surface eventually. He just hadn't lived long enough to see it. The recovered funds were distributed under court supervision. Homeowners were reimbursed. Local businesses received restitution. The county implemented new oversight measures that would make a repeat of this scheme far more difficult. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was real justice, and that mattered. The land itself felt quieter. Not empty, but settled. I started working with environmental specialists to protect undeveloped sections of the property. Conservation easements were established. Trails were restored. Areas that had been neglected under the HOA's obsession with profit were finally allowed to breathe. Wildlife returned. Elk moved through the trees again. The land remembered what it was before control replaced care. The community celebrated the changes with a simple gathering. No speeches. No banners. Just food, laughter, and a shared understanding that something important had ended and something better had begun. Kids ran freely across grass that had once been restricted. Neighbors talked openly without glancing over their shoulders. No one missed the old regime. People sometimes asked why I didn't take more, why I didn't push harder, why I didn't use the full force of what the law allowed me to do. The answer was simple. Power used without restraint becomes corruption wearing a different face. My grandfather didn't hold on to that land because it made him rich. He held on to it because he believed ownership came with responsibility. Finishing his fight didn't mean becoming what hurt him. It meant making sure it couldn't happen again. Months later, I received letters from other communities. Similar patterns. Similar intimidation. Similar abuse hidden behind paperwork and authority. I forwarded what I could to the right people. I shared documentation. I didn't chase new battles, but I didn't ignore them either. Some stories deserve endings. Others deserve prevention. On quiet evenings, I walk the boundary road as the sun sets behind the trees. Houses glow warmly. Conversations drift through open windows. The mountain stands unchanged, patient as ever, having outlasted every scheme laid upon it. The land was never the prize. Truth was. And once truth took hold, everything built on lies collapsed under its own weight. That was the lesson my grandfather left behind, even if he never knew how far it would reach. The war was over. Not because someone won, but because corruption finally lost.